The sheriff sensed something important slipping away. Probably his control over the situation.
Now, hold on,
he said.
How dare you barge into my castle and accuse my associates of the very crimes that they've dedicated their lives to fighting?
Watching from beside Kate, Guy sensed the situation beginning to spiral into chaos. The sheriff shot him an imperious glance and he began pushing his way towards the stage and the drama playing out on it. When Guy was still 15 paces away, Lazarus turned to address the crowd. The peasants were hanging on his every word, faces alight with fascination at this latest development.
What better disguise for a witch,
Lazarus asked his audience,
than as a witch finder?
Hugh laughed, but for the first time he sounded nervous.
That's preposterous, he said. What possible evidence have you got?
Lazarus half turned to face him, but his voice was still pitched to reach the back of the crowd.
The evidence of your own words, he said. You've heard it all. You've all heard it. The uncanny knowledge. These men have displayed far greater evidence of unnatural powers than the poor innocent woman they've accused of being a witch.
But that's...
Derek stuttered.
Our powers come from God, not the devil,
Hugh said more smoothly.
Do they?
Lazarus turned back to the townsfolk, and Guy felt a subtle but dangerous shift in them. They were on his side now.
I see Mistress Perry there, he said. How did this man, this stranger, know about the loss of your parents? And you, Farmer George, didn't this witch finder claim to speak with your aunt's spirit? Who but a witch communes with the dead? He's right,
a voice shouted from the crowd.
That Hugh gave me a message from my poor Beth, gone these 10 years.
The sheriff, who'd been startled into silence, suddenly seemed to remember that he was, in fact, the sheriff and in charge.
Gisborne!
He shouted.
Deal with this!
But that was easy for him to say. He was on stage, not surrounded by increasingly hostile peasants.
You've got to admit Lazarus has a point,
Marion said. Guy looked around, but she was lost somewhere in the crowd. She'd always been happiest in their company.
Gisborne!
The sheriff bellowed again. Guy realized that this was it. He really did have a choice. He could put a knife through Lazarus's ribs and end this. It might end him, too, if the crowd turned on him. But he couldn't really bring himself to care. He could kill Lazarus, and the sheriff would get his way and Kate would be burned to death. Or he could let Lazarus speak. He could find out if Marion was right, and these witch-finders really weren't to be trusted. He could do what Marion asked him this one last time. "Well," Guy said to Hugh and Derek, "what do you say to that?" Derek looked shocked. What on earth do you mean?"
Yes, Gisborne,
the sheriff said, his voice deadly cold.
Just what do you mean?
Gisborne knew how to win a fight. You took on the toughest opponent first. He turned to Hugh. You knew I wasn't sleeping. You knew about Marion. How?
My knowledge is a gift from God,
Hugh said. His voice was tight with suppressed anger, or perhaps panic. Really? Guy sneered. Then maybe the fact this girl didn't feel any pain when you stabbed her was a gift from God too. Don't be ridiculous, Derek said. That was completely different. Guy cocked an eyebrow at him. In what way? Derek gaped like a fish, mouth open and empty.
They cannot answer,
Lazarus said triumphantly. There was a roar of approval from the crowd, and those nearby smiled at both Lazarus and Guy. One of the peasants even pounded Guy on the back. It was a strange feeling, being admired by the commoners. He'd never experienced it before, and he wasn't sure he liked it. Lazarus spun to face the witchfinders, pointing an accusing finger.
You cannot explain the fell source of your unnatural powers.
Burn them! A voice shouted from the crowd, and soon a chorus had taken up the chant. The villagers surged towards the stage.
I can explain, Derek said frantically. All I said was that some old lady died whose name began with the letters M, or P, or W. It's not canon science, is it? Old ladies die all the time. They're old. And I said she had grey hair. She was an old lady. What colour's it going to be? Purple?
Shut up, you fool,
Hugh hissed. There was a smattering of gasps and some giggles from the crowd, and Derek seemed to finally realise what he'd said. He blushed a deep plum red and then spun to glare at Hugh.
Don't talk to me like that! Or do you want me to explain to them where your unnatural knowledge comes from?
Go on then, another voice shouted from the crowd.
Tell us.
Derek opened his mouth to respond, and in a desperate attempt to stop him, Hugh clamped a hand over his face. The other man tried to wrench it off, and a second later the pair had tumbled to the ground, wrestling for control. The peasants were roaring with laughter now, clapping and cheering the battling witchfinders.
He pays someone to get you drunk and find out your secrets!
Derek shouted in a brief moment of freedom, before Hugh tried to smother him with his own cloak.
And these are the men you'd allow to condemn this poor girl to death?
It was pandemonium in the courtyard now. Some of the peasants were screaming in fury, some laughing. Guy saw one man turn and punch his neighbour, using the chaos to settle a personal score. Then the man next to him kicked him, and soon a general brawl was raging out of control. Guy quickly lost sight of Kate in the seething mass of humanity.
Gespan!
The sheriff yelled from the stage. Guy drew his sword, but he knew there was no way he could fight his way through all these men to reach his master. And he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was the moment he became the man Marion had always wanted him to be.
Gespan, you cretin!
The sheriff screamed.
Lazarus is Robin Hood!
The pain couldn't have been greater if Guy had turned his sword and plunged it into his own heart. Of course it was Robin Hood, making a fool of him once again. Guy roared in rage as he flung himself towards the masked witchfinder. There were 10 feet separating them, a mass of tangled limbs and heaving torsos, but he forced his way through all of them, his sword clearing a path when his fists couldn't. He was vaguely aware that the sheriff's other troops were heading that way, an impenetrable circle of steel closing around the outlaw. It didn't matter. This was Guy's battle to fight and finish. 3 paces away, and Guy could see the white of Robin's eyes beneath the mask. He must know he'd been rumbled by now, but he made no move to escape.
You,
Guy grated.
you!
He raised his sword, then realized he wanted to watch Hood's face as he killed him. He wanted to see him suffer at least a fraction of the pain Guy had endured since Marion died. He grabbed for the leather mask and tore it away. It wasn't Hood. The face that stared back at him was the colour of aged oak, with stern eyes and a mobile, expressive mouth. It was the priest. Guy froze.
What?
He said, crumpling the mask with his fist. Tuck looked back at him and grinned. Guy felt his fury mounting and drew back his sword for a killing blow. This was Hood's doing, a perfect distraction while he... And then, just as the sheriff yelled,
He's getting away!
Guy finally realized what Robin's plan had been all along. He didn't need to see the flash of rapidly vanishing green as he snapped his gaze around to the stake and the pile of kindling in the center of the courtyard. But it was already too late. Kate was gone.